Over the last number of years, I've put together a lot of videos around RSP and RIF meltdown strategies. And for the most part, those strategies follow a pretty consistent framework. But every now and then, I'll run into a situation that fits outside of the norm. This was one of those situations. It actually put me in a bit of a pretzel when I first looked at it, which, to be honest, is usually when things get interesting, because when something doesn't fit the standard approach, it usually means there's a constraint somewhere that's forcing a different kind of decision. That's what I want to walk through today. Now, before we get into it, I'll say this up front. This is not a strategy that's going to apply to most people, and it's also not something you're going to see discussed very often. Not because it doesn't work, but because it sits a bit outside the usual way people think about structuring their retirement income. But in this case, it ended up solving a very specific problem. So what I want to do is break it down properly by going through the math, and then spend some time on where it works and where it starts to fall apart. Now let's set up the situation. Ben is 68 years old, single, and living in Manitoba. He's retired and his core expenses are covered, but every year he finds himself pulling back on the things he actually wants to do, like travel, helping family, or just having flexibility, because he knows the next dollar he takes out is going to get hit hard. And the reason for that is pretty simple. His income is already sitting right up near the OAS clawback threshold, so let's call that roughly $95,000. So any additional income he creates gets taxed and starts triggering clawbacks at the same time. So eventually the question becomes unavoidable. What would it take for him to just have a bit more flexibility? In this case, that number is about $10,000 per year. So not enough to completely change his lifestyle, but enough to stop thinking twice about every decision. So now the question becomes simple. Where is he going to get this $10,000 from? And this is where the constraint shows up. Ben doesn't have a TFSA, he doesn't have a non-registered account, all of his savings are sitting inside his RRIF. So his only option, at least at first glance, is to pull money from there. And this is where things start to break, because if he takes $10,000 out of his RRIF, he doesn't actually get to keep $10,000, not even close. So let's slow this down and actually run the numbers. Ben is sitting at roughly $95,000 of taxable income before taking anything extra out of his RRIF. And for simplicity, we'll assume he's already withheld enough tax on this income that he doesn't owe anything additional come tax time. Now from there, the next dollars he pulls out don't all get taxed the same way. The first part of the withdrawal fills up the Manitoba and federal tax bracket from $95,000 to $100,000. So that first $5,000 he takes out is taxed at 33.25%. Now there's something important to point out here. When Ben actually makes that withdrawal, he's not going to feel the full tax rate right away. The RRIF withholding tax on a withdrawal of this size is only 10%. So at the time of the withdrawal, it might not look like the tax is that bad, but that's just the prepayment. When he files his return, the rest of that tax shows up. So on that first $5,000 withdrawal, Ben pays about $1,662 in tax, which leaves him with about $3,300 in his pocket. So he's already behind the 8 ball after that tax bill. So Ben still needs another $6,700 to get to the 10 grand he wants to spend. But now he's crossed over $100,000 of income. So the next dollars are taxed even higher at 37.9%. At that tax rate, every dollar he takes out only leaves him with about 62 cents after tax. So to get the remaining $6,700 into his pocket, he needs to withdraw roughly $10,700 from his RRIF. So now we add those two pieces together. The first $5,000 takes him to $100,000 of income. Then he needs another $10,700 above that. So altogether, he needs to withdraw $15,700 from his RRIF to net out $10,000. So this is the first important point we want to cover. Ben can't withdraw $10,000 from his RRIF and then spend $10,000. He needs to withdraw roughly $15,700 from his RRIF. And that's before we even deal with old age security. Because Ben is already sitting right around the OAS clawback threshold, this extra RRIF withdrawal also increases his income for OAS calculation purposes. The OAS clawback is 15% of income above the threshold. So if Ben adds another $15,700 of RRIF income, the OAS recovery tax is approximately $2,300. Now, this doesn't show up immediately. It shows up the following year as a reduction in his monthly OAS payments, but economically, it's still part of the cost of this decision. So now let's take a look at the full picture. To create $10,000 of extra spending, Ben withdraws about $15,700 from his RRIF. Of that, about $5,700 goes to income tax, and about $2,300 is lost through OAS clawback the following year. So the combined cost of the withdrawal is about $8,000 of value once you combine the tax and the clawback together. And that's the problem. It's not just that the RRIF withdrawal is taxable, it's that this withdrawal is happening in exactly the wrong part of the tax system. He's already at the OAS threshold and now he's crossing into the next tax bracket. And he has no alternative source of funds. So every extra dollar that comes out of the RRIF is doing three things at once. It's creating tax, triggering clawback, and reducing the amount that's going to be growing in the future. At this point, the question starts to change. It's no longer should Ben take $10,000 from his RRIF. It becomes, does it make sense to pull almost $16,000 out of the RRIF, lose roughly $8,000 to the system in terms of taxes and clawback, just to spend $10,000 this year? And once you frame it that way, the answer isn't as obvious. So now we can start to compare that against an alternative, another source of cash that may look uncomfortable on the surface, but might actually be a cheaper option when you run the math. That other source is the HELOC, or home equity line of credit. For most people, this is where they stop because the idea of adding debt in retirement just feels wrong. You've spent decades trying to eliminate it, and now we're talking about bringing it back. But let's line it up against what we just saw. So now instead of withdrawing almost $16,000 from the RRIF, Ben could borrow $10,000 from a HELOC at, let's say, 4.95%. And at the same time, we'll assume his RRIF remains invested in a portfolio earning around 5.5% over the long term. Now, this doesn't require a huge spread to work. Even something relatively small can make a difference over time. But if that relationship flips, where the borrowing costs are higher than what the portfolio earns, then the advantage of this strategy starts to disappear. So now the comparison becomes very different. If Ben pulls the money from his RRIF, he needs to withdraw about $15,700 to end up with the $10,000 he needs to spend. Now compare that to the HELOC. If Ben borrows the $10,000 instead, there's no tax, there's no OAS clawback, and his RRIF remains intact. And at a borrowing rate of 4.95%, the cost for that year in interest is $495. So that's the comparison in its simplest form. On one side, you have roughly $8,000 in value disappearing when it comes to the tax and the clawback. And on the other side, you have an interest cost of $495. But looking at this over 1 year doesn't really answer the question because he needs this extra $10,000 for the next 10 years. Now, before we carry this forward over time, there's something important to address here because one of the first reactions to this example is going to be that the OAS clawback threshold increases every year. And tax brackets can do the same as well. So it might not be as bad as it looks. And that's a fair point. So let's account for that. Let's assume that Ben's income increases each year in line with inflation, and at the same time, the OAS clawback threshold and the tax brackets are doing the same thing. So in other words, he's still sitting right at the OAS clawback threshold, and every additional dollar he pulls out is still entering that same tax and clawback range. So now let's extend this out over the next 10 years while Ben's expenses remain high, using the same assumptions we just did. Ben needs that extra $10,000 every year from age 68 to 78. If he uses his RRIF each year to fund it, as we just saw, he needs to withdraw about $15,700 per year. So over the next 10 years, that's roughly $157,000 coming out of his RRIF. And along the way, he loses about $80,000 between tax and the OAS clawback. So for $100,000 of spending over that period, he's reducing his RRIF by over $150,000. Now let's look at that same 10-year period using the HELOC. So instead of withdrawing from the RRIF, Ben borrows $10,000 per year. So after 10 years, he's borrowed $100,000 in total, and at a rate of 4.95%, that grows to roughly to $125,000 of debt. So that's one side of the balance sheet, but the other side is where this starts to get interesting. Because that $15,700 per year isn't being withdrawn from the RRIF anymore. It's staying inside of there. And that's the part that's easy to miss. This isn't just about avoiding tax, it's about what happens to your money that didn't come out. Now, over 10 years, that's $157,000 that stayed in the RRIF. And if it stays there invested, earning around 5.5%, it's going to grow over time. So by the end of that 10-year period, it compounds about $215,000 inside of the RRIF. Now, it's also worth pointing out that this assumes a reasonably smooth return over that period. If markets are weak in the early years while the debt is still building, that gap can narrow because the liability continues compounding, even if the portfolio doesn't for a period of time. So now if we step back and look at the full picture at age 78, the RRIF is larger by roughly $215,000 and the HELOC sits at about $125,000. So now at age 78, the trade-off is real. He's got roughly $125,000 of debt sitting on the house, and that's the part that people focus on. But when you step back and look at it, there's roughly $90,000 of difference between the two approaches. Now that difference still sits inside the RRIF, so it's still pre-tax, but we're comparing two scenarios under the same tax system. So the relative advantage between the two approaches remains. Now there's one more layer to this that's worth pointing out, because when people see the HELOC, the first reaction is usually, I don't want debt in retirement, which is completely fair. But we also need to look at what's happening on the asset side. Let's say Ben's home is worth $1 million, growing at about 2% per year. Over that same 10-year period, the house grows to roughly $1.2 million. So about $200,000 of growth in the home's value. Compare that to roughly $125,000 of debt on the HELOC side of things. So even though he's borrowing against the home, the underlying asset is still growing faster than the liability attached to it. Now at this point, everything starts to look very one-sided. The borrowing looks cheaper, the RRIF is larger, the math works in Ben's favor. But we haven't actually finished the analysis yet, because eventually that line of credit has to be repaid. So let's walk through what that actually looks like. So in this example, after 10 years, Ben is now 78. His lifestyle starts to change. He's traveling less, his discretionary spending comes down, and instead of needing an extra $10,000 each year, he now has roughly $25,000 of excess cash flow. And importantly, in this example, that repayment is coming from excess cash flow, not from drawing even more out of the RRIF. So we're not just pushing the same tax problem forward. So now the strategy shifts. He's no longer borrowing, he starts to pay the HELOC down. So now he's got $125,000 of debt sitting on the house, and if Ben starts applying $25,000 per year toward that balance, and we assume the rate still sits around 4.9%, here's roughly what happens. In year one, interest is about $6,200. He pays down $25,000, so the balance drops to around $106,000. The following year, interest is applied to a lower number, plus he puts in another $25,000 against it, and the balance continues to fall. And this is the part that's important. Each year, the interest gets applied to a smaller balance, so more of that $25,000 is actually going towards reducing the debt. If you carry that forward, he's able to fully repay the HELOC in roughly 6 years. So by his early to mid 80s, that debt is completely gone. Now, this is where we need to bring both sides together, because up until now, we've looked at RRIF withdrawals versus borrowing and growth versus interest. But now we can compare the end state, so at age 78, of both scenarios. On the RRIF side of things, over that 10-year period, he withdrew about $157,000, about $80,000 went to tax and to the clawback, and he ended up with $100,000 of spending. Now at age 78, there's no debt, but the RRIF is significantly lower because of those withdrawals. Now on the HELOC side of things, over those same 10 years, he borrowed $100,000. That grew to about $125,000 of debt, but his RRIF remained intact and grew by roughly $215,000 higher than it otherwise would have been. Then from age 78 onward, he applies $25,000 per year and pays the HELOC off in about 6 years. So now let's fast forward to that point, call it age 84. At that stage, the HELOC is fully repaid and the RRIF is still higher by a meaningful margin relative to the alternative of drawing the RRIF down first. And this is the key comparison. In both scenarios, the debt is gone, but in one scenario, the RRIF was drawn down early in a very expensive tax environment. In the other, the RRIF was preserved, allowed to compound, and the cost was handled later under better conditions. That's the full cycle. And when you look at it end to end like that, the strategy becomes clear. So this isn't about replacing RRIF withdrawals with debt. It's about changing the timing of when those dollars come out. Because in Ben's case, the dollars he would have taken in his late 60s and early 70s were some of the most expensive dollars in his entire plan. So instead of forcing those withdrawals at that point, he delays that pressure, carries a temporary liability, and resolves it later when the environment is more favorable. So the natural question is, why doesn't everyone do this? And the answer is because there are a few specific assumptions holding all of this together. And if those assumptions change, the outcome changes with it. The first one is the rate difference. In this example, we assume the RRIF is earning around 5.5% and the HELOC is costing roughly 4.95%. If borrowing rates move higher or investment returns come in lower, that advantage starts to shrink And if that flips the other direction when you're borrowing at a higher rate than you're earning, now the strategy starts working against you. The second piece is time. This only works because there's a defined window. In Ben's case, he needs an extra $10,000 for about 10 years. After that, his spending drops. If that doesn't happen, so if that $10,000 turns into something permanent, then the interest does start compounding over time, and that's where the strategy starts to break down. And the last piece is probably the most overlooked, but it's behavior. So even if the math works, this only works if it's followed through. If the borrowing continues longer than planned, or the repayment doesn't actually happen, or the portfolio is changed during a downturn, then the outcome can look very different from what we just walked through. So this isn't a free lunch, it's a trade-off. You're choosing to avoid a very expensive withdrawal today in exchange for carrying a liability that you plan to deal with later. So this was one way to think about the RSP or RRIF meltdown strategy, but if you want to have a deeper dive into how it actually works, then check out this next video.